In episode 52, titled Exploit Selection and Safety, we're focusing on a professional reality that is easy to say and harder to live, choosing proof methods that demonstrate risk without causing damage. The point of an engagement is not to rack up dramatic screenshots or to win against a system. It is to provide credible evidence of risk that leads to remediation. That means your proof method has to be proportionate to the objective and compatible with the environment's tolerance for disruption. When exploit selection is done well, it looks almost boring because the work is controlled, scoped, and predictable, and the evidence is just enough to be convincing. The moment it becomes exciting is often the moment you are taking unnecessary risk. Exploit selection is best understood as matching technique to objective and environment sensitivity. The objective might be to confirm reachability, demonstrate a permission boundary failure, prove code execution is possible, or show that a configuration enables unauthorized access, and each objective implies different proof options. The environment sensitivity includes whether the target is production, whether it supports critical operations, whether outages are acceptable, and whether the system is known to be fragile. A technique that is acceptable in a lab or a staging environment can be unacceptable in production, even if the technical steps are identical, because the operational consequences are different. Good selection also considers the engagement's rules of engagement and authorization, because you cannot justify a method that violates scope just because it is convenient. The guiding idea is that proof is a means, not an end, and the proof method should be chosen accordingly. Validation sometimes suffices, and exploitation is not always necessary to produce a credible, actionable finding. If you can confirm the vulnerable condition exists, confirm it is reachable, and describe a realistic impact boundary using safe evidence, you may not need to execute a full exploit to make the risk clear. This is common for misconfigurations, exposed admin surfaces, overly broad permissions, and certain web access control issues where the behavior itself is the proof. Even for code execution class issues, you can often demonstrate preconditions and limited impact signals without pushing into takeover behavior. The key is to align proof level with what defenders need to fix the issue and what stakeholders need to prioritize it. If the evidence already supports remediation and the risk is understandable, additional exploitation can become a liability rather than a benefit. Professional testing is about sufficiency, not maximalism. Risk factors shape every decision in exploit selection, and you should be able to name them before you act. Production stability is the most obvious, because exploitation can create load spikes, crashes, memory corruption, or service restarts that disrupt users. Fragile systems are another risk factor, especially legacy services or specialized appliances that behave unpredictably under unusual inputs. Unknown side effects are common when exploit code was written for a different environment, when it makes assumptions about dependencies, or when it triggers system behaviors that are not obvious from the outside. Another risk factor is data sensitivity, because some exploit paths can expose more data than needed, creating privacy or compliance problems even if the goal was simply proof. When these risk factors are high, the correct response is not to be brave, but to choose a safer method or to coordinate for a safer window. Controlled execution principles are what make exploit use professional rather than reckless. Minimal payload means you use the smallest action that demonstrates the vulnerability's effect, avoiding anything that persists, propagates, or changes state beyond what is necessary. Limited scope means you target only what is in scope and only the specific systems you need to prove the point, rather than broad spraying across a subnet or a fleet. Clear stop rules mean you define in advance what conditions cause you to stop immediately, such as instability indicators, unexpected output, or signs of sensitive exposure. Control also implies a clear understanding of what the exploit will do, including what it will touch, what it might break, and how you will detect side effects quickly. This is where experienced testers stand out, because they treat exploit execution like a controlled experiment, not like a gamble. Exploit options come from several sources, and understanding those sources helps you evaluate trust and suitability. Public exploit code is widely available for many issues, but it varies in quality, safety, and assumptions, and it often includes default behaviors that are not appropriate for a controlled engagement. Frameworks can package exploit techniques and payloads into reusable modules, which increases efficiency but also increases the risk of using defaults that do more than you intend. Custom modifications are sometimes necessary to make a proof method safer, such as reducing payload impact, limiting target scope, or adapting to environment-specific constraints. The point is not that one source is always better, but that every source carries implicit design choices that you must surface before using it. When you treat exploit options as artifacts to evaluate rather than tools to blindly run, you reduce the risk of surprise outcomes. Evaluating reliability means asking whether the technique is likely to work in your environment and whether failure modes are safe. You consider prerequisites, such as specific versions, configurations, network access, authentication states, or user interaction requirements, because missing prerequisites leads to noisy failures and wasted effort. You consider detection likelihood, because triggering defensive controls can disrupt services or lock accounts even if the exploit does not succeed. You consider disruption risk, including whether the exploit is known to crash services, consume resources, or leave the system in an unstable state, because those outcomes can be worse than the finding you are trying to prove. You also consider repeatability, because a proof that works once by chance but cannot be repeated is difficult to defend and hard for defenders to validate. Reliability in this context is not just will it pop, it is will it prove the point predictably without collateral damage. Now walk a scenario selecting between two options, because this is where exploit selection becomes a judgment call. Imagine you have a confirmed vulnerability on a production service, and option 1 is a safe proof that demonstrates limited code execution in a controlled way without persistence, while option 2 is a higher risk takeover method that aims for full control but is known to be unstable and intrusive. The objective is to demonstrate risk clearly enough to justify remediation, not to maintain access or pivot broadly, so the safe proof aligns better with the goal. The environment sensitivity is high because it is production and stability matters, so the unstable option carries unacceptable operational risk unless there is explicit authorization and coordination. In most professional engagements, you choose the safe proof because it gives you credible evidence while preserving availability and trust. If stakeholders truly require demonstration of deeper impact, you would coordinate timing and controls rather than defaulting to the risky option. Capturing evidence responsibly is part of safety because evidence can easily become over-collection if you are not careful. You want minimal data that proves impact, such as a controlled indicator of execution, a permission boundary observation, or a limited output that demonstrates access without revealing sensitive content. You avoid collecting large data sets, dumping memory, or exfiltrating files simply because you can, because that increases risk and can create obligations that complicate the engagement. You also document the context of the evidence, such as what was requested, what the system returned, and why that supports the finding, so the evidence stands on its own without requiring dramatic interpretation. Responsible evidence also means protecting what you capture, because sensitive artifacts must be handled securely and shared only with authorized parties. The best evidence proves the point and stops, which is exactly what a safe engagement requires. Pitfalls often occur when people use default payloads without considering what those defaults actually do. Default payloads can be overbroad, noisy,
or persistent, and they can trigger behaviors that are unnecessary for proof, such as creating users, changing configurations, or opening connections that defenders interpret as hostile escalation.
Another pitfall is overbroad targeting, where someone tests across many systems at once, increasing both disruption risk and the chance of touching out-of-scope assets.
Poor rollback planning is also a serious pitfall, because even controlled tests can create small changes, and you need to know how you will reverse or mitigate those changes if something unexpected happens.
A related pitfall is not defining stop conditions, which leads to just one more try behavior that can spiral into instability or policy violations.
These pitfalls are avoidable when you treat exploit use as controlled validation rather than as a demonstration of power.
Quick wins in exploit selection are usually the simplest ones. Choose the smallest action that proves the point. If you can show that an endpoint is reachable and misconfigured, you do not need to chain into deeper access just to feel thorough. If you can demonstrate a privilege boundary failure with one controlled example, you do not need to enumerate every possible object that could be accessed. If you can confirm code execution with a benign indicator rather than a disruptive payload, you should choose the benign indicator. These quick wins reduce risk, reduce noise, and often speed remediation because defenders get clear evidence without feeling like testing created its own incident. In practice, the smallest proving action is often the most persuasive because it is precise and easy to reproduce. When risk is high, communication needs become part of the technical plan because coordination reduces surprise and protects stability. You coordinate timing, such as choosing a window where operational impact is acceptable and where support staff are available to observe and respond if something goes wrong. You coordinate escalation paths so you know who to contact and what to do if you see instability, sensitive exposure, or unexpected behavior. You also communicate the intent and boundaries of the proof method, which helps defenders understand that you are performing controlled validation rather than uncontrolled exploitation. This communication does not weaken your work. It strengthens it by ensuring the right stakeholders are ready and by reducing the chance that your actions are misinterpreted. In professional engagements, the best technical choice is often the one that is safest and most coordinated.
To keep the essentials sticky, use this memory anchor: objective, risk, control, evidence, stop.
Objective reminds you that proof exists to support a defined purpose, not to satisfy curiosity.
Risk reminds you to account for stability, fragility, and unknown side effects before acting. Control reminds you to limit payload, scope, and variability so execution remains predictable.
Evidence reminds you to capture only what is needed to prove impact and support remediation. Stop reminds you that restraint is a success condition, not an afterthought, because you halt when proof is sufficient or when safety signals appear.
To conclude episode 52, titled Exploit Selection and Safety, remember that safe selection is what turns exploitation from a risky stunt into a professional proof method. You match technique to objective, prefer validation when it is sufficient, and treat high-risk actions as exceptional decisions that require coordination and strong safeguards. If you need one safeguard you always apply, make it a clear stop rule tied to stability and sensitivity, such as halting immediately on signs of service degradation or unexpected exposure and documenting exactly what you observed. That safeguard forces you to stay in control even when a technique behaves differently than expected. When you combine objective-driven selection with controlled execution and disciplined evidence handling, you demonstrate risk credibly while protecting systems and trust. And that is the standard Pen Test Plus wants you to understand. Being effective is important, but being safe and professional is non-negotiable. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.